Well, good afternoon, everybody, and greetings from Town Hall Europe in the heart of Brussels. I'm Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow here at Friends of Europe, and I'm delighted to be the moderator for today's debate, where we will be asking the question, Quo Vadis Iran, particularly with a new president, and of course the nuclear file and the possibility of returning to the Iran nuclear deal uppermost in the minds of both Iranian and Western diplomats. Iran is a country which always seems to be either in the news or making the news. It's never far away from the front page of our newspapers. Sometimes this is because of domestic stories. I mentioned the recent elections where we've had large-scale anti-government protests on and off in Iran in the past. What does this mean for the future of the country and its stability? We've had the question about how well Iran is coping or not coping with the COVID-19 pandemic. But, ladies and gentlemen, let's be frank, most often Iran is in the news for its external and foreign policies and behaviour. Of course, the most immediate issue, which will be our focal point today, is the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, otherwise called the Iran nuclear deal, and the question, can it be rescued? Can it be saved in the old form or in a modified form? We want to know how important is this nuclear file in terms of the evolution of the West's relations with Iran. Can it be a game changer? Can it help international non-proliferation efforts? But we also, of course, need to focus on Iran's regional behaviour. Another reason why it's often in the news, its activities, some would say interference in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen and Iraq. Also, of course, attacks on shipping in the Gulf, which have been attributed to Iran recently using drones, and a long-standing accusation that the Islamic Republic has been behind multiple terrorist attacks over the last few days. The West relations with Iran, well, let's be frank again, have been a rather bumpy affair ever since the Islamic Revolution back in 1979. Hostility rather than cooperation or even dialogue has characterized the relationship. Henry Kissinger quipped famously once that Iran was more a cause than it was a country. But is there prospects that in future it will be less of a cause and more of a country? Will it be open for cooperation with the West, or will it join or increasingly integrate into the awkward squad by coming closer economically to China, militarily to China and Russia? So today we want to focus on the nuclear file, absolutely, but we want also to broaden out the discussion and the conversation to look more broadly at what is happening with Iranian civil society and how much influence it still has, the prospects for the country with a new president, more of the same, or will there be reforms and changes? Are there opportunities to engage, or is it going to be more stormy weather ahead? Well, fortunately, I don't need to answer any of these questions, and I have four of the very best experts that we could possibly find who are going to precisely do that for us. First of all, I welcome back to a Friends of Europe platform Negar Mortazavi, who is an Iranian-American journalist. She's a Friends of Europe young leader for the Middle East and North Africa. She's really one of our favourites. I mean, every time we want to discuss Iran and the Middle East, we turn to Negar, and we've never put a question to her which she has not answered with insight and brilliance. So, Negar, I see that you're not in your kitchen today. I'm slightly disappointed because I was coming to admire your kitchen. You are obviously in a library or a study, perhaps a more dignified academic background for a very serious topic. I'm going to turn to Negar to lead us off in just a moment. But we also have Sussan Tahmasebi, who is a leading advocate for women's rights and the director of FEMENA, a very clever acronym because it's an organisation which defends women's rights across the MENA region. Sussan, delighted to welcome you today as our second speaker. We're going to be joined by John Wolfsthal. John is a senior American strategist and thinker. He's currently the senior advisor at Ground Zero. NATO, former Senior Director for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation on the National Security Council. When I asked my former boss, Rose Gottemuller, a former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, who we should get, she said, John is absolutely the key person. Unfortunately, we managed to get him, and John will give us a sense of how things are progressing or not progressing in terms of resurrecting the Iranian nuclear deal. And finally, we're in Brussels, ladies and gentlemen. We are a think tank which believes firmly in European political cooperation and integration. So we always want to have an EU-Brussels perspective on matters. And of course, the EU is an active player both on the nuclear file and in relations with Iran. So Eldar Mamedov will be the last speaker, wrapping up the panel. He's the political advisor for the Social Democrats on the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Parliament. So, Eldar, a very warm welcome and thanks for joining us. So, obviously, panelists, our gratitude that you're here today. Ladies and gentlemen, I've asked the panel, this is a little bit of a lost cause sometimes, but I'm hoping that today we're going to pull it off. I've asked our panelists to keep their opening remarks to a maximum of 6 minutes. Because then we will have time for you, dear audience, to come in with your questions. Please, as we are doing something that you've all done a million times over the last 2 years, which is using a Zoom-type platform, please raise your hand. Please don't use the chat to ask a question because it's difficult for me, the moderator, to keep track of all of the chat dialogue. So please raise the hand, much easier for me to see. Give your name, your organization, please, when you ask your question. And please keep your questions brief so that we can have as many questions as possible. Usual stuff, right? And thank you for being ready to comply with that. And when you're, of course, not asking a question, if you could keep yourselves on mute, that tends to help the technology and the comprehension of everybody concerned. So, Negar, I've asked you to give us a scene setter, get us going. So, the impact and the significance of the last elections. More of the same, or could we really expect some surprises going ahead from President Raisi? What, if there are prospects for change, in which direction would that change likely to go? Particularly, I mentioned the Russia-China options. And your own take on the Iran nuclear deal. I know John will take us into the details later, but do you see that resurrecting this deal is more or less likely after what you've seen of the negotiations, at least up until June so far? So give us the overall picture, and that will warm us up and get us into the details a bit later on. Negar, welcome back, and I pass you the virtual microphone.
Thank you, Jamie. Thanks to you and to Friends of Europe for hosting another excellent event, very important and timely on Iran. And hello to my fellow panelists and friends, Sussan, Eldar, and John. It's great to see you all, and thanks for everyone who's tuning in. Let me just start by summarizing what happened in the past few years, especially under President Trump's presidency, which basically led to a consolidation of power by the Iranian hardliners who started gaining momentum as a result of the campaign of maximum pressures. Obviously, a lot of domestic issues inside Iran, which I'm confident Sussan is going to explain in more details. But the Iranian hardliners, and as you also mentioned, Jamie, briefly, with President Trump's very tough rhetoric on Iran and rhetoric and actions, the pulling out of the JCPOA, pulling the United States out of the nuclear deal, imposing very strict economic sanctions on the country, the assassination of top Iranian general by the United States, later top Iranian nuclear scientists by the Israelis, and also, as you mentioned, the military escalations in the Persian Gulf region, some done by Iran, Iran's proxies, and also sort of the proxy war happening between Iran and Israel and escalating. All of these, which I'm sure all of you have heard more details about in the past few years, led to the hardliners sort of taking the upper hand in Tehran, gaining momentum, and also putting an effort into consolidating power, marginalizing the moderates, the pro-diplomacy camp in Tehran, as I'd like to call them, and just making things more difficult and complicated when it comes to diplomacy and engagement with the West, which is the focus of our discussion right now. And the consolidation sort of started with the Iranian parliament, which is now controlled by the hardliners. The hardliners use the Guardian Council to filter out most of the competition, reformists and moderates, and gain control of the parliament, regain control of the parliament. And then, obviously, as you mentioned, the president. It was the turn of presidency. So the tradition in the Islamic Republic in the past 4 decades has been that each president has stayed for 2 terms, 8 years. So this election in the past June was the turn of presidency. There's a hardline president now. There was, as I've explained it in more detail in the past, sort of an engineered process when it came to the election. There was a massive disqualification of moderate and reformist rivals. Any top candidate who would be a viable competition to Ebrahim Raisi was basically eliminated from the race, for this path to open for the hardline president Ebrahim Raisi, who won in an election that had the lowest participation in the history of the Islamic Republic, and he also won a low percentage of vote, barely enough to become president, and also by eliminating the competition. So this is the situation in Iran right now, with moderates completely weakened, completely marginalized, the reformists completely weakened and marginalized, and the country also dealing with a lot of domestic crises, ongoing anti-government protests. The population is very angry. The economic situation is fairly weak. And with all that, the nuclear deal is still alive, but I call it on life support. And it becomes a very difficult question, because in the first 6 months of President Biden's administration, basically when he came in January, many of us were hoping that a return to the nuclear deal would be made towards the beginning of his administration, but basically it would be an easy process, it would be quick, and I think it could have been done. Many experts have been saying that it could have been done, but there needed to be a political capital spent for that here in Washington, because it's also a very polarizing issue in Washington, and sanctions relief for Iran, going back to full compliance under the deal. All of those are very complicated, and it basically didn't happen in the first 6 months. And I called that a golden window of opportunity when President Biden his administration coincided with a moderate or pro-diplomacy administration in Tehran, the same team who negotiated the nuclear deal in the Iranian administration were still in power. Over here, most of the same people who negotiated the nuclear deal on the US side are back in the White House or the State Department, and things could have been done faster and easier. Now they've basically hit a roadblock. From now on, I think the path is going to be more complicated, more difficult as far as a return to a nuclear deal with a hardline team as a partner on the other side. And as far as Iran, just to finally wrap up your question of Iran's political direction, it's going to take a more hardline political direction. That means moving further away from the West, shifting more towards the East, towards China, towards Russia, a very different outlook on economic relations, on trade, even on security, Iran's regional policy. The hardliners tend to promote a more aggressive regional policy, less of a dialogue, less of diplomacy, and more of force and proxy wars. There have been some talks of engagement with Iran's regional rivals, foes, specifically Arab countries of the Persian Gulf. And there may be some hope in that for the Raisi administration, especially because his foreign minister is someone whose expertise, Amir Abdullahian, his expertise is actually in focus, has been the Arab world. So there may be some surprises there as far as Iran's outreach to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But when it comes to the nuclear deal, when it comes to diplomacy and negotiations beyond the nuclear issue, which is something President Biden had been talking about, that he's interested, between Tehran and Washington, I think the road ahead is just more complicated and more bumpy than it was when it coincided with a moderate team in Tehran. And this president in Iran is most likely going to have 2 terms. So that means the Biden administration will have to be dealing with a hardliner in Tehran for the rest of his 1 or 2 term presidencies. And this is an unfortunate recurrence in the recent history of U.S.-Iran relations, because these windows of opportunity have always been very short, and most of the time it's an anti-diplomacy team that coincided with someone who wants to amend relations, and that's made things more difficult and complicated. So I'll stop there. I don't know if I used all of my 6 minutes. Hopefully I didn't go over, but I'm happy to answer any questions and looking forward to the rest of the panel.
Well, Negar, thanks. To be honest with you, I was so interested in what you were saying that I took my eye off the clock. So if you did go over the 6 minutes, it was time we all spent well. Jonathan Swift used to say that his purpose was to inform, not to entertain. And you've given us a sobering account, but obviously we have to be realistic. And you've mentioned there are opportunities, but they come rarely. And difficult to recover if you miss them. A more hardline political direction, particularly with an 8-year term, so likely more stormy weather ahead. But thank you, Negar, as always, for setting the scene. Let me now turn to Sussan. Sussan, I'm not an Iran expert, but I often get the impression that Iran is a bit of a paradox. On the one hand, a very hardline regime, which is used to and ready to use repression, but civil society, if I'm not wrong, survives and is vibrant and occasionally expresses itself very forcefully, for example, in the demonstrations about the economy or about the vaccine. So where do things stand? How vibrant is civil society, and what kind of influence could it bring to bear, for example, in getting a resolution of the nuclear file? Does it have a role there at all, or maybe at least pushing a regime, whether it wants to or not, perhaps in a more open reformist direction? So give us your take, and I know that you're particularly interested in the situation of women and their rights. So tell us how it is today in the Islamic Republic.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you to Friends of Europe and everyone who's joined this important event. Yes, of course, you know, I'm a member of civil society and I believe in the power of Iranian civil society. I think Iranian civil society has consistently surprised many. But nevertheless, the situation in Iran at present is a very difficult situation for civil society and for human rights. We expected that during the Rouhani administration that the space for civil society would open up. Of course, it didn't. We had competing security agencies basically repressing and cracking down on civil society during his term. We anticipate that the situation will get worse. Already, a number of activists have been arrested who asked for accountability from the state on its inability and its unwillingness to address the COVID pandemic. 3 people are in prison, including Mehdi Mahmoudyan, who is a leading human rights activist, for asking for that accountability. So I anticipate in the next 4 years, the next 8 years, that we're going to have more of the same when it comes to civil society. Iranian civil society over the last 12 years has been facing systematic repression, really longer than that, but particularly the last 12 years has impacted its ability to be active and vocal and hold the government accountable since the 2009 elections. So we anticipate more of that. There's several elements that impact civil society. One is the state repression. Of course, I think we hear about that quite often. It's state repression that doesn't allow civil society to be active. It arrests civil society activists, human rights activists. The other element is the fact that Iranian civil society is extremely isolated. Like the Iranian state, the Iranian civil society is extremely isolated. It's not connected to international supports, doesn't receive international solidarity. It's hardly ever, I don't want to say never, I think there's a few times, but it's rarely engaged in international discussions about the future of Iran, especially these political discussions that are really critical, and we need to have the input of civil society. And then the other element that impacts civil society negatively is the economic situation, which in part is due to the sanctions, in great part it's due to the sanctions, but also because of state corruption and state mismanagement. So what's happened in the last several years, especially with the COVID pandemic, is that a lot of the organizations that are working on human rights and accountability have had to reduce the level of the work that they're doing to respond to an economic and health crisis that Iranians are facing and do more charity work rather than higher level human rights work. So this is, and I anticipate that the next few years are going to be more of the same. We have a serious hardliner also in the judiciary who is going to crack down. He was formerly the Minister of Intelligence, who's also going to crack down pretty severely on civil society. And we see signs of that. And we also have promises of restricting further the internet, access of Iranians to the internet, which is where Iranians have been organizing. So I don't see this as a hopeful period when it comes to civil society. I also want to talk about accountability. I think that that's an important issue for you. Civil society is not as engaged on the nuclear issue. It has rarely been engaged on the nuclear issue. I think where the civil society can hold the state accountable is on economic issues and JCPOA, and really call the state to come to some sort of agreement with the West just to relieve economic pressures. But nevertheless, as I said, many of the civil society activists are, under pressure and they're arrested the minute that they call for accountability. There's several accountability measures that are going on in the US and in the West. One is Hamid Nouri, who is one of the people implicated in the 1988 massacres. President Raisi is also one of the main figures that's implicated in the massacres, the killing of political prisoners who had prison sentences. They were executed. So this is an issue that could come back and haunt the Iranian president in the future in terms of holding him accountable. But I anticipate that there's not going to be much accountability from civil society when it comes to the nuclear issue, except for the economic situation. Those who held Hassan Rouhani's government accountable on the nuclear issue tended to be hardliners, not so much civil society, but hardline groups affiliated with the current hardline president in power. So I anticipate that they're not going to hold Raisi accountable on any of those issues either. Lastly, I want to point out to the fact that, because international politics impact civil society so greatly, there is a fear among civil society groups that Iran, there might be some sort of agreement between Iran and the West, and then human rights will be neglected. So I think it's important for Europeans who understand Iran a little bit better than the Americans to make sure that human rights continues to be or is center stage with respect to its relationship with Iran, and to hold Iranian government accountable on human rights issues. And nevertheless, whether there is an agreement with Iran or there isn't an agreement with Iran, civil society and human rights needs to figure prominently in the work of European governments when it comes to relations with Iran, that they need to pay attention to how to support and strengthen civil society, but also how to support and strengthen human rights in a way that doesn't endanger activists on the ground. I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to answer any more questions with respect to civil society and human rights in Iran and its interplay with the JCPOA or otherwise.
Sussan, thank you very much. Like Negar, you gave us a sobering but realistic assessment of the situation. Civil society is still there, thank God, but on life support. Not connected to the West. Is that our fault in terms of not being more active? But you raised the question, which is always there, what kind of Western help helps and is not counterproductive in making the situation worse for civil society activists. You also indicated that the EU could have a niche role there in terms of keeping alive the flame of human rights. Not being willing to sacrifice them for any sort of geopolitical deal. God forbid that were the case. But certainly, yes, what actions could be helpful, that's something I'm sure that somebody's going to ask you a question about when we get to the discussion. Sussan, thank you. John Wolfsthal is next. I've introduced him already. And with John, of course, we now can dive down into the specifics of the Iran nuclear deal. I asked John a few questions already, and I asked him in particular to give us a sense of whether the negotiations are alive or dead. They haven't resumed since June. Does that mean that they're really blocked, or are both sides just taking a breather before coming back to cut the final agreement? In the meantime, of course, Iran continues to enrich and to develop its nuclear infrastructure. Has it sort of reached a dangerous new level where it might sort of not want to come back to the deal because it might feel that it has too much to give up in terms of its nuclear capabilities? Does Iran or the United States, the West, need a deal most? I asked John also, sorry, John, for so many questions, but China and Russia were at least part of the agreement last time round, even if obviously the US did most of the heavy lifting and the EU with the negotiations. Are they being equally helpful this time round, or given the more tense relationship with Russia and China and the West, have they decided this time to take the Iranian side? And I asked you too, because of course we are in Brussels, John, how, from a US point of view, how useful can the EU be as a mediator, or what kind of role could it play which would help the Biden administration get over the line? John, delighted to see you. Too many questions, but we're looking forward to what you can enlighten us on. I pass the virtual microphone to you, sir.
You're very kind, and thank you so much for having me. I consider myself a friend of Europe, so I'm happy to be participating in the Friend of Europe forum. I also happy to see a number of friends, and especially since I know if I get something wrong, Barbara Slavin will correct the record, since she's as deep an expert, if not more so than I, on many of the matters that we're going to discuss. This has been a sobering discussion so far, and so let me try to hit you with a little bit of good news before I sober you up, which is that we have to remind ourselves Iran does not have a nuclear weapon. Iran is not on the verge of having a nuclear weapon. And there's no indication that Iran has any intention to build a nuclear weapon. And so as we digest these issues, I think it's really important to keep in context that we're not necessarily on the edge of a cliff and about to fall off. However, what Iran is doing, and the lack of success in returning to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is troubling. Iran is continuing to advance its ability to enrich uranium, which it does not need for civilian purposes, and which can be very useful should it ever decide it wants to build nuclear weapons. It's continuing to advance its knowledge base on advanced centrifuges, which can enrich uranium more quickly and more efficiently, which makes it harder to put the verification scheme back in place should the United States and Iran and other members of the JCPOA get back to an agreement. And Iran is still refusing to clear up very serious and very real questions about its past nuclear activities, specifically related to when it had a weapons program prior to 2003. At the same time, Iran is pushing the envelope on what it is doing with the International Atomic Energy Agency. And this is something that the United States and the European Union and all states, I think, have an incentive in pushing back against. We have seen behavior that should be considered completely unacceptable by Iran towards international inspectors. Harassment of female inspectors, damaging IAEA monitoring equipment. These are not things that in and of themselves should precipitate a crisis, but they're a sign that Iran is engaging in behavior just as they are on other issues, which we should find troublesome as countries committed to the rule of law and international peace. Now, that being said, I think there's plenty of blame to go around in terms of the current situation. Clearly, I would say primary blame goes to Iran for having pursued nuclear weapons prior to 2003. But having committed to the JCPOA in 2015, obviously the United States under President Trump deserves a tremendous amount of blame for his withdrawal from a working agreement which provided a basis for improving relations with Iran and peace and stability for a significant period of time. But we are where we are, and where we are is really quite concerning. The window of opportunity, I think, between President Biden and a more engaged, I hesitate to say moderate, but a more engaged administration in Iran has closed. That often happens, and you have to deal with the governments that you have to deal with. And there's an argument to be made that if you can close a deal with a conservative government, then perhaps that's more sustainable over the long period of time. But the Raisi administration is clearly still getting up and running. They have a lot of challenges, just as the United States has a lot of challenges. And I don't think the failure to get back into the JCPOA so far is a result of a lack of effort by the Biden administration. I think the Biden administration made it clear we were prepared to go back in. We wanted to go back in. What the Iranians were requesting was something the United States had said in terms of the complete lifting of all sanctions up front is something that we were not in a position to do legally, nor was it something we thought was advisable to do in the context of the agreement. And Iran pushed what it thought was a strong hand, and now we're in a situation where we don't have the agreement in force, and the benefits of the agreement are rapidly eroding. I do think the Biden administration would like to get back into the JCPOA with Iran, and I do think the Biden administration would like to use that to expand the terms of the agreement, to lengthen it, as President Biden has said, and strengthen it. It is not clear that Iran has any interest in doing that, however. And to get to the question from the moderator, who has a stronger incentive to get back into the agreement? I would argue that that's not the way I would want to look at it. The agreement becomes less valuable to the United States and to the non-Iranian members as time goes on, because the constraints in the agreement, while some of them never expire, including Iran's prohibition on ever pursuing nuclear weapons, the limits on enrichment, the ability of Iran to break out of a non-nuclear situation erode over time. And this was, of course, the main criticism from the American domestic audience and from Israel, that, well, as we get closer to year 15 in the agreement, it becomes less relevant. The argument was, of course, the United States would be in a stronger position with regards to Iran in 2030 than it was in 2015. I guess we can debate whether or not that's true given domestic situation in the United States. But I would argue that I think both the Iranians and the United States have sort of overplayed their hand and need to come back to some base principles, which is neither side benefits, nor do the other JCPOA member benefit if Iran is much closer to a nuclear weapon than a year. That is an unstable situation which provides temptations for both Iran, the United States, and I would argue other countries in the region to take action which affect the status quo unilaterally. Iran clearly would benefit economically. I wouldn't say all elements of Iranian society, because clearly some elements benefit, as I learned from Barbara, more than others from the sanctions regime. But the Iranian country would benefit from the lifting of sanctions. And I think the United States would be able to pursue what it would like to do in terms of reorienting its foreign policy more towards China over time if it were able to get a stable nuclear agreement. But agreements are hard, and there is a lack of trust all around. The United States doesn't trust the new administration in Iran for good reason. The Iranian administration doesn't trust the United States for good reason. And I think this gets to the last question, which is what role can the European Union and European states play? And I actually think this is critical, especially in the wake of the withdrawal from Afghanistan and in the wake of the submarine deal with Australia, which France has clearly expressed tremendous frustration and even anger with. European voices matter to President Biden. He believes in alliance relationships. If Europe believes that it is in its interest for Iran to be back in the JCPOA and the United States to be back in the JCPOA, then that needs to be communicated clearly, and the EU foreign policy effort and the individual European countries need to coordinate and effectively communicate that message, just as they must communicate that to Iran, that their future economic relationship with Europe and the European Union depends on them fully committing to their non-nuclear future. The final word here, and I'll quote somebody who's not on the call, former boss of mine, George Perkovich, said many years ago when we were actually back, I think in 2006, 2007, and Barbara, he probably stole this from you as well, which is this whole dynamic of negotiating with Iran and the United States is all about who wins Europe. Whose side is Europe going to be on? Is it going to be on the side of the United States and the rule of law, or is it going to be on the side of engagement with Iran and economic interests? And I would argue that that remains true today. While Russia and China are important, if Europe believes that Iran should be committed to a non-nuclear future and works with the United States, then I think the prospects for a deal go up. And I think if they commit more intricately with Iran and decide that, well, the United States can't be trusted and we're just going to go the way of our economic self-interest in terms of dealing with Iran on fossil fuels and other issues, then I think the prospects for a deal go down. And that puts a lot of pressure on you guys, but we're looking for all the help we can get here in Washington, and we hope we can get some from our European allies. So with that, I'll turn things back over to the moderator.
John, thanks very much. Thank you for taking us through a very complex subject briefly and very clearly. Thank you also for delivering an interesting, strong political message to Europeans at the end. I'm sure that Eldar is going to pick up on that when he comes in. Greetings to Barbara, who was mentioned on several occasions, and welcome, Barbara, if you want to intervene in the discussion in just a few moments. For my question, though, John, not to answer now, but two sort of things struck me about what you said. Number one is okay, but now that the negotiations have been frozen for several months, how do we get them restarted? And secondly, as you said, the JCPOA has a sell-by date because circumstances change, interests change as the years go by. At what stage, if we can't go back to the deal, or it doesn't make sense to go back to the deal, do we sort of wipe it out and say, hey, we want to deal with Iran, but it now has to be a JCPOA Mark II, based on the new sort of technical and political realities, and how do we get the Iranians to do that? Anyway, those are just two thoughts that occurred to me, John. Maybe you could pick them up as a kind of question from the moderator when you come in. Barbara, I see you put your hand up. Thank you for responding to the challenge. But first, let's listen to Eldar Mamedov from the perspective of the European Parliament. Eldar, John issued a sort of challenge to the Europeans. How do you see the European role? Are we going to sort of go on one side of the fence and not the other? The EU has sort of acted as the chair in the past successfully to steer the negotiations through. Can European diplomacy sort of pull off the magic trick a second time? Let's have your perspectives, and a warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to speak at this event. At the outset, I want to just make it clear that I speak on my own behalf, in my private capacity, not necessarily reflecting the position of my political group or the European Parliament. So I'll do my best. So I'll pick up where John, the previous speaker, left, and that is about the European position and perspective. So indeed, as he rightly noted, the EU was always committed to the JCPOA. And for the EU, it was not a question of choosing sides between Iran and the United States. It was the choose a side of international law, of effective multilateralism, of non-proliferation, and achieving the goal of non-nuclear Iran while avoiding a very dangerous and unpredictable military escalation. So what happened in 2018 with the Trump administration, everybody knows that. European Union in that situation, both collectively and on the level of E3, UK, France, and Germany, the signatories of nuclear deal, was adamant that JCPOA has to survive and made a lot of political statements to that effect. The problem, however, was, as seen from the Iranian side, is that those statements were not backed up by any serious delivery on the European side of the economic dividends that Iran secured and expected as what it was entitled to as part of the deal, which I have to remind Iran stick to for full 14 months after Trump administration withdrew from the deal. So that put the EU in a difficult position vis-a-vis Tehran. It also did not help that occasionally it looked like the E3, not the European Union collectively, but the E3, looked like, let's say, too eager to please the Trump administration by pointing to Iran's regional activities, which we all agree are problematic, especially Syria, Yemen, and other places. But the problem, at least from Tehran's perspective, was always to single out Iran as a uniquely malign and destabilizing player in the region, whereas it's clear that other players, such as Saudi Arabia, for example, or United Arab Emirates, in their war in Yemen, for example, are also far from blameless. So this perception of a lack of European strategic autonomy, if you want, something that we talk about a lot these days in Brussels, also as a consequence of the French-Australian UK-US crisis. So this lack of strategic autonomy was something that was perceived as a weakness of the European Union, and also diminished its leverage in convincing Iran to stick to the deal. So where we go from now, we see that the EU is still very active in trying to bridge the differences between US and Iran. Fortunately, the things do not go very smoothly because just as this week in UN General Assembly, Iranian foreign ministers there, Amir Abdollahian, the foreign ministers of some European countries, then the political director of the ES, Enrique Mora, who is very actively engaged in trying to midwife at least some informal conversations between P4, the remaining parts of the JCPOA, and Iran, without yet participation of the US. But it seems that this did not work out, and there won't be such a meeting in New York. But at the same time, we see that Abdollahian has bilateral meetings with the French and British foreign ministers. So the hope is still there that even though this is a missed opportunity in New York, that some other opportunities will be presented and seized upon. Because essentially, from the European perspective, there is still no convincing alternative to the JCPOA. Now, towards, I was asked on EU-Iran relations beyond JCPOA, and unfortunately, the way things look like with the new administration in Tehran, it's not very promising. I remember that in April 2016, when then High Representative Federica Mogherini and Javad Zarif signed a joint communication. It outlined a lot of areas of potential constructive engagement between the EU and Iran, and at that time it was believed that JCPOA would serve as a foundation, but not as a ceiling for EU-Iran relations. So with the current administration in Tehran, I'm afraid that it's rather the other way around, that if JCPOA is successful, it's rather going to be a ceiling rather than a foundation for a new kind of more constructive relationship between the EU and Iran. That said, however, there are still some areas where engagement will be necessary. One of them is, of course, Afghanistan. The European Commission singled out Iran as one of the countries in need of most assistance in coping with the situation. So hopefully that will provide some channel of constructive engagement between EU and Iran, which hopefully will also spread to other areas. So I would stop here and will be happy to answer the questions.
Eldar, again, thanks for being informative, for being brief, and for kindly answering the questions that I posed to you. It's always great not to be ignored when you're a moderator. We've got 3 hands that have gone up. I mentioned already Barbara Slavin, so Barbara first, then Paul Taylor, my dear colleague as senior fellow here, and then we've got Natalia Pouzyreff. So what I'm going to do is bring in the 3 questions. Please short. If it's to a particular person, please indicate. After those 3, I'll ask the speakers quickly to pick up, not exhaustively answer the question, every question, but just pick up what they're interested in from their own perspective. If we go fast, we should have time before we close for a second round. So Barbara, the virtual microphone is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, John, for such generous remarks. Very kind, and it's nice to see some familiar faces. Jamie, I remember your voice from many NATO briefings after 9/11. So very nice to hear you again. Just a couple of points. I think that this administration in Iran will come back to the talks in Vienna. They will play games this week in New York, perhaps, but a lot of pressure is being put on them, not just by Europeans, but also by the Russians, and to some extent the Chinese. And Iran needs sanctions relief if Raisi, who is incredibly unpopular, is going to be able to deliver anything to the people there in terms of economic benefits. So I'm a little less inclined to doom and gloom. I think there'll be a lot of foreplay and hemming and hawing, but they will get back to it. The other thing I'm hearing is that there may be a revival of talks about Afghanistan, the so-called 6+2, the neighbors of Afghanistan, and Russia and the US, which means another potential format for US-Iran engagement, multilateral, but an old format that was used, frankly, back in the 90s as a way to break the ice between the US and Iran. So I think the situation in Afghanistan, particularly the refugees and so on, is acute enough that Iran sees a need to be part of an international consensus on this issue and not to be isolated as the Shea power that gets all of these refugees dumped on it. Internally, I agree with Sussan. I think it's really bleak. But I'd be interested in the views of the speakers on whether we are perhaps being too doom and gloomy about return to JCPOA and whether there are some prospects for work with Iran on Afghanistan that could be mutually beneficial and beneficial to Europe, which is also going to face another bunch of refugees. So thank you very much. And over to my old partner in crime, Paul Taylor.
God, Barbara, you know, we know you and you know all of us. It's great to re-engage. Yes, Paul knows quite a thing or two about Iran, as I'm sure he's going to demonstrate as he makes his comment and poses his question. Paul.
Thank you, Jamie. Thanks to the speakers for very good briefings, and greetings to my former journalistic partner in crime, Barbara, an old friend from Tehran and other desperate places in the Middle East. Actually, I really just have a fairly short question, and I think I can address it specifically to John Wolfsthal. And it is, does the Biden administration have a free hand to ease sanctions in return for a revival of the JCPOA? What constraints does it have to take into account? Because, you know, we talk a lot about the hardliners and the moderates in Tehran, but, you know, seen from the outside perspectives, the battle between the hardliners and the moderates in DC could do with a little bit of illumination as well. Thank you.
Okay, Paul, a pointed question to John. And then before I bring in the speakers again, we've got Natalia as the last in this round. So Natalia, the virtual microphone is coming your way now.
Thank you, Jamie. And thank you really for this interesting debate. It's not a question, it's just more like a reaction to what was presented, is that we can measure now the damage done due to the collapse of the JCPOA. Because if there was once upon a time a little bit of trust, there's no more trust anymore amongst the negotiators, I'm afraid, and both sides. So I think that the level of threat is increased because we have now the ambiguity, you know, if Iran would use a ballistic missile, even armed with a conventional warhead, that now the players in the area could question if it's a conventional or nuclear armed weapon. So for me, the level of threat has increased, and it's a sad, I would say, constatation. And I hope we can get out from this deadlock, and from I think we need to get out from ambiguity concerning the threat, the level of threat that is present in the area. And I'm thinking about, the way Israelis are considering the situation on their side as well. Thank you anyway.
Many thanks indeed, Natalia. So, John, I'll go to you first, if I may, for the round of answers, because clearly you got from both from Barbara and from Paul some issues picking up on the JCPOA, maybe not so much doom and gloom, things may be going on behind the scenes. Paul's question about American domestic politics. So over to you first. Maybe Negar next to pick up this idea, could we sort of talk to Iran about Afghanistan humanitarian issues and at least start a dialogue there? And I'll bring in the other speakers also to comment. John, please.
Sure. Well, look, Barbara is often right, and I hope she is on this case. And I think the way she's laid out the chess pieces makes sense to me, that Raisi is unpopular and does need to deliver the same way that the previous administration wanted to deliver because it helped their domestic political fortunes. I wouldn't say that the Biden administration has a completely free hand, and I think that gets back to the reason that we aren't back in the JCPOA right now. You can't overstate how hard the Trump administration worked to poison the well and make it difficult for the Biden administration to actually get back to the JCPOA. But we're also dealing with legal constraints here in the United States under the Iran Nuclear Review Act, which says that if the United States lifts sanctions, and it needs to certify that Iran is in compliance with the terms of the JCPOA, I believe within 30 days. And so the United States can't simply lift the sanctions and say, okay, Iran, you do what you need to do to get back into compliance, or else it triggers provisions which allows the Congress to vote to reimpose sanctions that the president can't easily waive. And so Iran and the United States have to go to this dance together. And where we got into trouble with the JCPOA negotiations over the first part of this year was Iran say, well, you pulled out, you have to go first. And we said, well, we can't go first because we have laws and we actually have to follow them. And so we have to do this together. And Iran said, well, no, we got an election coming up. We're not doing that. So it is possible, and I hope that Barbara's correct, that Iran will hem and haw and come back to the table. But I think now that we've shown that, look, there are some constraints here, but we are serious, that will restart the process. Jamie, I just want to very, very briefly touch on this question of JCPOA 2.0. And I think reasonable people here, Eldar, can agree to disagree. We don't know what the Iranians may want to talk about if we get back to the JCPOA. We do know what the United States and our allies would like to talk about, which include not just capping the Iranian nuclear potential, but also other activities, including in Iran and Iraq and Yemen and Syria, and behavior towards Israel and proxies and missiles. Those are all serious issues. I don't think, and I think it's been proven, that we don't want to let those issues prevent us from putting the JCPOA back in place, but we have a lot of things to talk about. If we get the JCPOA in place, that provides a basis for having those discussions and makes it a little bit easier. If we don't, then I think it makes all those issues a little bit harder, and that's something that we all, I think, need to just keep in mind.
John, thank you. Thanks for answering very succinctly those two questions. Negar, anything you picked up from the debate that anybody said that you want to respond to, and particularly this suggestion that maybe in a humanitarian area, maybe, the fact that the Taliban are now back in control in Kabul and how Iran may be sensing any sort of problems in the region resulting from that. Are there sort of areas where you could have a sort of dialogue that will at least open up the channels of communication, or do you think that the situation is as dire as many people have been saying?
Sure, Jamie. Let me just quickly respond also to Paul, because he very correctly pointed at this political rift basically here in Washington. It's true, the Democrats are back in the White House and they have good power in the Congress. But as I mentioned, there was a political capital that needed to be spent for a return to the JCPOA, and that's something that President Biden wasn't prepared to do at the first few months of his administration. There were even detailed reports of more hawkish Democrats like Senator Bob Menendez and a few others who were important hurdles, basically, to negotiations, to starting negotiations with Iran and also return to the JCPOA. But going to the Afghanistan issue, I agree with Eldar, Barbara also, great to see you, that Afghanistan can be an icebreaker, at least with the involvement of Europe. It's a very serious issue for Iran. Iran is the second largest host of Afghan refugees after Pakistan. It has a large border with the country. Now with the chaos in Afghanistan, Relief International was reporting that 5,000 refugees are crossing into Iran by the day from Afghanistan. There have been millions of Afghan refugees in the country. The economic situation is pretty grim. And it's going to be difficult for the country to host even a larger number of refugees after the US withdrawal. So, and it's in direct interest of Europe, of the European Union, because if these refugees are not resettled in neighboring countries, obviously they're gonna go towards Europe. So I think both from a financial perspective, from a security perspective, and also obviously above all a humanitarian perspective, this issue of Afghanistan is something that can be an icebreaker for Iran and Europe, and potentially to bring Washington into the picture. And it's also an issue that Iranian moderates and hardliners, or both the pro and anti-West camp in Tehran, have an interest in, because it's something that's basically happening on the ground and they have to deal with, especially now that the hardliners have all the power in Tehran. So there's some hope there. Again, as I said, there may be some hope in the regional issues, but I hate to be the pessimist. I just don't see, unless there's a major shifting of gears, either by the Biden administration or something extraordinary happening in Tehran, I just don't see the JCPOA moving any much further than it did in the first 6 months of President Biden's administration.
Negar, thanks very much. The clock is rapidly reaching the end of our hour, but of course I want to give both Sussan and Eldar a chance to pick up on anything that was said with some closing thoughts. Sussan, I know that what was said on the humanitarian front will probably resonate with you. So how do you interpret the prospects there?
Thank you very much. And thanks, Barbara, for the shout out on the human rights situation. Yes, the situation looks bleak, but I don't think that people should just write it off because it looks bleak. I mean, I think it's our job to sort of warn about the negative possibilities, but also the positive possibilities. I think that, the part of the problem is that no one has any leverage on Iran on human rights issues. So it's important to sort of, in these negotiations, to try to get some sort of leverage to sort of hold Iran accountable on human rights issues. Iranians, and including civil society, do want some sort of economic relief, some sort of sanctions relief. So even if Europe or the US can't come to terms with the Iranian government, they should think about economic relief, at least on the humanitarian front for civil society, in terms of negotiations with Afghanistan, or the sort of engagement with Iran on Afghanistan. And I would say on other fronts as well, that we need to think seriously about including civil society as part of those negotiations and part of those cooperations. I think that civil society has largely been written off by the international community. And even when, and I appreciate the fact that we're included in this discussion, but I think even when we're included in this discussion, predominantly people are very much focused on the politics. But as we see in Afghanistan, the politics may end up being some sort of really crazy result, and who's left to pick up the pieces is actually civil society. So it means that we have to take the role of civil society seriously and ensure that civil society is strengthened. So I just really want to stress that. And lastly, I just want to say that all of this lineup of the hardliners is intended for the secession of the supreme leader. So this could possibly be a turning point where civil society can come in and play a role if there is an issue of secession. That's why it's absolutely critical that civil society is not isolated, that it's strengthened.
Sussan, message received loud and clear. I apologize for just breaking in there, but we've got 1 minute to go, and Eldar, of course, deserves to have his final word. Eldar, please.
Thank you. I just want to pick very quickly on what John said concerning ongoing, or let's say, forthcoming negotiations on proxies and missiles and other elements of problematic Iranian behavior or policies in the region as a next step after the JCPOA, if it's restored. I just want to make clear that it could improve somewhat atmospherics and create better conditions for talks. But those talks on missiles, proxies, etc., they should never be conceived by the Western side as a way of extracting unilateral concessions from Iran, because Iran sees those as essential elements of its defense posture. So the way forward would be regional talks, which would involve all the regional players and put all the issues on the table, not only Iranian missiles, but also, let's say, Western arms sales to countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE.
Yep.
And discuss a sort of regional security arrangement. That would be the way for the future, and US and EU should definitely support that.
Thanks, Eldar. That's, again, a very, very clear message. All four speakers, you've been absolutely fantastic. Wish we had more time. Thank you very much. Audience, you're always fantastic, particularly those of you who intervene and ask those great questions. So thank you to them today. I usually like to give long summings up, but the clock has defeated me on this occasion. Just to say that clearly no great prospects for change, stormy weather ahead, more of the same. But the West, of course, has got to help civil society stand up for human rights, help civil society in a constructive way to hold the government to account, perhaps more on the economic situation than on the nuclear deal. On the nuclear deal, also difficult given where we are, legal, technical constraints as well. But let's not indulge too much in doom and gloom. We've heard that both sides have an interest in getting back to the table, and both sides means Iran as well. We just need to find a way through the woods. If the JCPOA can be saved, it could open the door to a broader dialogue on many other issues. In the meantime, diplomats have to look for opportunities where and when they arise. The regional situation, a regional comprehensive dialogue embracing all of the actors, dealing with the new situation in Afghanistan, humanitarian situation, difficult inside Iran and in the region. There may be some areas for bridge building and construction there. So let's batten down the hatches, but let's hope also for some good news ahead. So again, on behalf of Friends of Europe, goodbye from Town Hall Europe. Look forward to seeing you at the next debate. And in the meantime, take good care and stay on Zoom, waiting for that moment when we can welcome you all back here in these wonderful surroundings on a sunny day in Brussels. Bye.